Another in a continuing series of events, programs, meetups that we have done over the past several years at TVO on this issue. We have this Learning 2030 series that a number of you have been, you were a part of that, Annie's been a part of that, which are all on our website, theagenda.tvo.org. So if you want more background to that, we've done numerous programs on the thinking that a kid who was born last year, by the year 2030, what kind of education system, what kind of technology in the class, what kind of post-secondary system would they be graduating into, what kind of elementary and secondary system would they be graduating out of. So these are some of the issues that we've been tackling for the last couple of years. And we also at TVO have a digital learning division whose job it is to sort of develop digital educational products. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this is really not new territory for us. We're interested in this, and to that end, let me introduce our guests who are going to be with us this evening. In the middle, you'll recognize Annie Kidder, the Executive Director of People for Education, and then moving out along, Jonathan Lewis, who I am to call John, not Jonathan.
That works. Yeah.
That works. He's a grade 7 and 8 York Region District School Board teacher, teaches in Vaughan, lives in Barrie, loves the commute, right?
Of course, of course.
Maybe not. On the other side of Annie is Joseph Wilson, who I'm not supposed to call Joseph, but Joe. He's a senior strategist in the education practice at Morris Discovery. And then beside me is somebody we met in Waterloo, I guess. You were on our program in Waterloo, Michelle Cordy, who is a teacher grade 3 and 4 at Thames Valley District School Board, which is what actual place?
Actually in London, Ontario.
In London, okay, very good. And at the far end is Scott Welch, who's the co-founder of EDSB, which is software that moves K-12 schools, as he describes it, securely into the cloud and transforms how students, teachers, and parents engage, as Captain Picard would say.
Yes.
Engage. Okay, got it. Let's get into this issue then, and Joe, I'm going to ask you to go, am I? No. Who am I going to ask to go first? Scott, let me get you to go first. Answering the main question tonight, what should government do to spur on innovation in education? Start there, if you would.
Okay, it's actually a hard question, and I'll tell you why. So I've been building communication solutions for schools for 25 years. I built a successful email product, and then we building this new product, EDSB, for the last 4 years. Schools are very complicated because they are run by one group of people, managed by another group of people, and consumed by a third group of people. And none of those groups particularly get along. And all of them are deathly worried that something bad might happen. And so it's sort of a recipe for never changing. That's why, I often joke that really the only difference between when I went to school and when my son went to school is that when I went to school they used mimeograph machines, and now they use photocopiers to fill up the backpack. But other than that, it's exactly the same. So the whole rest of the world has changed. The question is, how can we bring those changes into education? And the answer is, we have to do it very carefully, because, we can't just put data out there in places that are unsafe. Schools, they're conservative, they're slow changing for a reason. And so we have to respect that and sort of work within that framework. It's actually a real challenge.
But the approach that you've taken, if I understand it, is you have not gone to the Ministry of Education and said, here's our stuff, take it, spread the good word.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Why have you not? You're dealing with school boards individually, yes?
Yep.
Which presumably is logistically more complicated since you're dealing with a lot of different entities. But on the other hand, you're avoiding the morass that is the Ministry of Education.
Sadly, the brass in the Ministry of Education doesn't provide the gold to do it. So here's the problem. So here's a good example. Like, you guys how many people have ever ordered a book from Amazon here? Like, yeah. Isn't it nice? You get a little email telling you that the book is shipped, and you can find out exactly where it is, and it's fabulous. Now here's the sad thing. I know more about a book that I ordered from Amazon than I know about how my child is doing in school, which is 1,000 times more important to me. The reason is, if I don't like Amazon, I can go shop somewhere else. If the government comes along and says to a school, this is a great product, you should use it, unless they fund it, the school won't adopt it. So if you want change, You have to fund change. So, like in Florida, they actually put $45 million in place just so that parents can find out what homework their kids have by looking on their mobile device. But they funded it. That's the key.
Okay. Scott, thanks for getting us started here. Joe, why don't you pick up the pace from there? What do you think government should do to spur on innovation in education?
Sure. Well, my own background is as a high school teacher, a high school science teacher, but now I work here at the Mars Discovery District with entrepreneurs in the for-profit sectors and not-for-profit sectors who are seeking to introduce new, usually technological innovations into the system, like EDSB. And this can range from platforms, apps, games, electronic textbooks. There's a wide range. The entrepreneurs that we work with have a very specific problem, and that is, and this is something that Scott has experienced firsthand, and that is that there is no standard way of introducing new technologies into the system. There is no pathway to do that. It depends on who you know and if you can get a teacher to try it. And it's a very wild west of different products used here and there. And some of them work and some of them don't. There's very, very little standards around on the digital side. And that's a problem for adoption. And it's a problem because we don't have data to make informed decisions with. It just doesn't exist. So one of the things we'd like to see from the government is an innovations pathway, which is a pathway to introduce new innovations into schools across the province and at different districts. And a systematic way to test these new innovations to see what works, gets scaled, what doesn't work, go back to the drawing board. In this way, the districts and the schools can set up kind of technological requirements too on what they need in terms of routers or bandwidth or privacy concerns, reliability of software, because there are currently no kind of standards around that at the provincial level. I mean, this kind of thing, this does two things. For Ontario, it makes education better for many kids, and especially at the high school level, where engagement levels are so low. These digital tools really have a role to play in keeping kids engaged. And the second thing, kind of at a more fundamental level for our economic development as a province, this can really recast Ontario's expertise in education as a force for economic growth, for entrepreneurship. I mean, Ontario has one of the largest clusters of education innovation anywhere in the world. And we would love for the government to recognize that fact. I mean, here at Mars, we've got about 180 education entrepreneurs that we work with day in, day out. Last year, those companies raised $55 million, brought that money into Ontario, and created 700 jobs. And just last week, there was a Toronto Board of Trade report released that identified education and knowledge creation as the second fastest growing cluster in the Greater Toronto Area in terms of job creation. So this is a moment for Ontario to really brand ourselves as a world hub of education innovation, and not just in kind of K-12 standardized test scores, which we do pretty well in, but on the innovation side and in those pathways to scale.
Can I just follow up, Joe? If you have a new idea for an innovative technological product that you think would advance our educational standards in Ontario, are you saying there's nowhere to go with the Ministry of Education? There's no one to talk to move the thing along?
No, there isn't. There isn't a defined place. There are places that you can try and get support, that you can try and work your way in from different angles, but there is no pathway for testing. There's no pathway for introduction. It doesn't exist. And each board does it a little bit differently as well. So it can be very frustrating.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know this really well. And the problem is that you got to remember each board is independent. They make their own choices, right? They don't all use the same computers or the same databases or anything like that. So effectively in Ontario, you have 50 independent decision-making bodies. Across the US, you have 15,000, right? Across Canada, you have 1,500. And each of those makes independent decisions, and each of them are deathly worried that something might go wrong.
So risk averse.
Very risk averse, because it's our kids' data, for good reason, right? They have to be risk averse.
Okay. Annie, your turn. Come on in here and tell us how you would answer the question about government spurring on innovation?
I feel like I'm going to be the crank, but maybe I'm always the crank, I feel like. I think it's really, really, really important. Innovation has become a word we use as kind of synonymous with technology, and it's not. That innovation is about much more than that. I think there is a lot of room for innovation, and I think that it's really important. We just put out a report 2 days ago on digital learning in Ontario's schools. We do think it's incredibly important. I'm not so much a crank that I'm going, it's not important and very valuable, and there is wonderful work being done, and both these gentlemen are correct that right now there's no way of evaluating it. Everybody's doing it differently. It is a bit of a Wild West, but I think it's really important that before we have that conversation or just focus on technology as if it's, you know, the cure for everything, we have to think about what we're innovating for, what our goals are, and to me, an innovation in Ontario would be to broaden our goals for success, our description of success. We're working on a whole project called Measuring What Matters, where we're looking at what do we measure and why, and what are we missing in what we measure. So we measure reading, writing, and math, and those are incredibly important things, but there's a lot more to life and education than that. And certainly by 2030, our kids are going to need a really wide range of skills and competencies. And I think I'm going to say even business, but I don't even mean even business. The employers understand, but we also understand people who are looking at the kind of life of our communities, at our engagement in citizenship, that there are a lot of skills and competencies that we're not focusing on enough. So, and if you look at the work of Roger Martin or other people talking about what those are, Stuart Shanker, social emotional skills, some of which you can foster incredibly well through technology. It's a wonderful place for creativity, social emotional skills, citizenship, problem solving, learning to work collectively. But it makes a big difference. But I think first of all, we have to go, what do we want from our education system? What kind of kids do we want to turn out? And how can we make it a little bit more aligned with what happens after they graduate? So what are the kinds of skills they need to be able to be successful at university, at college, at work, at home? How do we get them to vote? Nobody votes anymore. How do we get them to have a sense of social responsibility? We just had a horrifying report from the UN on climate change. How do we get kids to have some sense that this is really important to them, that they're connected to their worlds? So yes, technology is important, but it isn't innovation. Innovation is really the way that we think about education. And I think that for the last 20 years, we've gotten awfully simplistic in that way, that it's the joke I always use, that because there's so much politics in education, then we love the kind of simple success or failure. So we like, the graph, up good, down bad, the end. So for us in our organization, again, even though we understand digital learning and digital literacy is an incredibly important thing, we think first we have to set broader goals, figure out how we're going to measure those goals, and then figure out what we need to do in our schools in order to instill those in kids.
Let me ask you the follow-up, the rubber hitting the road follow-up, which is, I get how an app is technological innovation that could lead to improved outcomes of whatever you want in education. But non-technological innovation, can you give me an example of, like a concrete example of what you're referring to?
So a non-technological innovation is to understand, for instance, that social emotional skills aren't some soft, mushy thing that you're just born with, that you can actually teach them. So they're real skills you need to spend time on. You need to spend time on them when kids are young, and you can actually measure success in them. So an innovation would be for the government to go, these are the things we're going to measure. We're going to measure reading, writing, math, and social emotional skills and creativity, say. But we're going to see exactly how that fits into the curriculum. We're going to make sure there's space for that, and we're going to teach it. And we're going to convince, and People for Education is going to do this for them, so they'll be okay. We're going to convince the outside world that these are real things that should be happening in schools. That, to me, is an innovation, and it is a change away from the kind of metrics we've been stuck on now, and also the pressure and focus in schools, which has really been quite a lot to get your scores up. I mean, there is work to be done in technology, but we have to do even that we ignore neuroscience in our schools. It would be, there's a great quote from the former Minister of Education, apparently in France, could be apocryphal, who said, "The brain, what's that got to do with education?" And so we have to know all the things we've learned about how brains work and use that to teach.
Okay, you three come at this from one perspective, and now we have two
Actual
perspectives
teachers.
who are on the front lines of this every day and may have a different or, similar perspective. Let's find out. Fire away. Innovation in the classroom. What could the government do? You're on the front lines. What does that look like to you?
You know what, I think it's easy to start pointing fingers and saying, what can the government do? But I think when it all comes down to it, it's these partnerships. What can we do to continue to advance these things forward? I think that it's easy as a teacher to feel like there's not, your network isn't as large as it could be, and you're not sitting down with as many people as you should be when it comes to innovating in the classroom. And I think that, I agree, Annie, that I think that part of that focus has to be on the pedagogy. I think that for a long time where we throw devices at kids and throw technology at kids and think that we're going to make miraculous things with the devices that we have or the apps that we have or whatever have you. But I think at the end of the day, it's what are we doing to support the learning, and how does the technology support the learning? And how are we getting teachers to understand, sort of going back to your idea around some of those competencies and some of the learning that's happening, how are we supporting that pedagogy through the whole thing? How do we get them to, even teachers, show them how to use these devices effectively in the classrooms? Because I think sometimes it's like, great, I have 10 iPads, and now my classroom is going to be cutting edge. And it's
Right.
and it's the idea of, okay, what are we doing with those iPads? How are we approaching some of the citizenship pieces, the collaboration pieces, all those things that we're doing that we know are going to impact kids in the future, and how are we leveraging those things? And then how are we sitting down with our edtech designers and saying, okay, this is where we have to go.
Yeah.
How can we support that through the design process? I think that a lot of that has to do with empathy and what's happening in the classroom, empathizing with the sort of daily grind, if you can call it that, in order to influence some of the ed tech stuff coming in. I think is really important.
As I look around the room, some of us thought technology in the classroom meant a Bunsen burner. Okay? It wasn't state of the art like today. So what have you got in your classroom?
I have. Working through York Region District School Board, I had the privilege of being part of a Literacy at School program, which was having teachers sit down with other teachers in the board and try to innovate practices, and then bringing administrators or superintendents into your classroom and showing how the tech's being used. And so I'm fortunate to have 10 iPads in my classroom, as well as we were able to...
10 iPads for how many students?
I have 28.
So what do they do?
So, great question. I think that part of it goes back to what we're talking about. I mean, what are the skills that kids need for 21st century learning? Well, we need those collaboration pieces. The iPad's a great tool for that, for collaborating. We're looking at a lot of the Web 2.0 stuff, like how.
But it's called an iPad, not a WePad.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do
Exactly.
how do three kids all at once do an iPad?
It depends on what you happen to be doing. Depends on what, I mean, we a lot of the materials that the kids are consuming we're putting either through their Google Drive or through Dropbox, and so kids are able to access those materials there, as well as when we present ideas or you're consolidating learning, you can consolidate with an iPad between three kids, and then all of a sudden we have an Apple TV. We operationalize those in York Region, and so they can wirelessly send their stuff to the Apple TV. Then is all of a sudden on the screen. So
Does everybody know what that is? Apple TV? Yes, everybody.
Yeah.
Of course you do, because you're here tonight. So you know, of course. Okay.
and so that way we have when we talk about how we're setting up our classrooms for success in the future, it becomes the front of the classroom is lost because you don't have this like one-way communication all the time. You're able to have banks of kids that are learning together to be able to send their information to the screen and have conversations. I teach visual arts, so it's pretty awesome when kids are creating things. You can stop the class, have them use it almost like a document camera, where whatever is underneath the iPad can be wirelessly seen on the screen. So then that way you can stop, have a discussion, employ some of those critical skills as to how are things moving forward. What would your suggestions be as they're creating this? And then be able to support that and build that into the criteria and have kids reevaluating and continuing to innovate as they're working.
But nowhere in any of the conversation we've been having so far have you actually said, here's what I depend on the provincial government of the day to put innovation in my classroom. Sounds like you think that's your job or your decision.
You know what? I think in many respects, as a teacher, when you walk into your classroom, you feel responsible for those kids. I think if the government wants to impact change, then we need to be seeking out those partnerships and be making those partnerships more easily happen. Because I think, for the most part, teachers that are in the school are almost, in some ways, are disconnected to some of those decisions and policies being made, especially specifically around innovation. I mean, when we think about what tools we're using in the classroom, you're still seeing a lot of diversity across not only school boards, but within the school boards. And there are certain tools that the board has supported, but then there's other tools that as teachers, we're like, this is a great tool. I want to use this in the classroom. And because it fits with where you're going pedagogically, if you can say that. And so it's great to be able to, as a teacher, be able to innovate some of that as well. And then it's how do we as teachers be able to then access some of those decision makers in our board so we can have some of those technologies also coming to the forefront. And as well as, what's kind of cool about that too is then it's connected to the pedagogy. So then not only are you promoting that tool, but you're promoting a way of using that tool in your classroom with it.
Gotcha. Michelle, before we start, I'm having a minor panic attack since I pronounced your name two different ways when we started, and I'm not satisfied that I actually got it right. So
It's Michelle Cordy.
It is. I got it right eventually.
You did.
Eventually.
Yes, gold
Okay.
star. Well done. Level 4 on the rubric.
Silver star.
You can measure that.
Would have been a gold star if I got it right the first time. Okay. Okay, let's get you to weigh in on this. Innovation in your classroom, what does it look like?
Innovation in my classroom and innovation across all of Ontario and beyond, the most innovative people in education are...
Kids.
Yes, correct. They're the innovators. They're the ones that are in this process of learning, and the world is infinite, and we're there to help form their understanding of that world and their connections in that world, and we do that at school. So the worrisome thing is that in some cases, perhaps many cases, kids are coming to school and they're learning to not be innovative. And so we do have to think about the skills that we want them to have in the future. And I'm all for that. I'm all for democracy and voting and all that good stuff in the future, but I also recognize that I work with 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds every day. And each day in the classroom should be irresistible learning experiences. It should be magical. And if we can use innovative teaching practices, and I agree, all technology and innovation are not synonymous, but innovative use of technology can help us create a learning environment that, like I said, is irresistible, where students can see themselves in the curriculum. So how can government spur on that innovation? How can the government help us in the classroom do this? I think we always need to start with the students. And I think that there needs to be some space in the curriculum. Annie touched on that. There has to be some room in the curriculum for students to see themselves, for them to inquire, for them to ask questions, and then have the teacher as mentor help guide those inquiries and those collaborations. So I teach grade 3 and 4. The grade 4 curriculum, in half the year, I'll cover 4,500 years of history. That's serious. If you have to cover that kind of content, you cover it, you don't uncover it. So if there's no space in the curriculum for students to see themselves and ask their own questions, do they get to innovate right now? Will they be innovators in the future? I suggest not likely. If there's no space within the school day, meaningful space, not just clubs, those are fantastic, those supplement the school experience for children, but there needs to be space within the school day that's structured, where we're accountable, we're measuring these innovations, where students, with the guidance of their teachers, can explore what's possible.
But the day is only,
Yeah,
you're leaving for school at 6 o'clock in the morning every day, right?
Pretty close.
Okay,
Yeah.
even before 6.
Sure, so that's where technology can play a role, because technology can help us amplify and augment the opportunities within the classroom. It can give students opportunities to make creations of their learning, make their learning and their thinking visible to themselves, most importantly, to me, to their parents.
But there's only so many hours of the day, and there's only so many hours where their attention span is available to during the course of the day.
Yeah, so we need that time to be awesome, irresistible. It has to be delicious. You should be able to dive in with both feet to the questions that are being presented. And I think that with having more space in the curriculum for that to take place, for students to ask their own
What
questions.
does that mean? You keep saying that. Have more space in the day or in the curriculum. What does that mean?
There needs to be some white space, some blanks, let the students ask their own questions. No, seriously, because I'll be like, boys and girls, what would you like to learn about medieval times? And then I take their statements, and then I'm like, yes, that's good, because they named 3 out of the 5 curriculum expectations, and I'm going to go with those. Whew, those 2 inquiries that they're interested in that aren't in the curriculum, I can't go there. So I wonder if our curriculum has perhaps gotten to the point where it's so broad that it's shallow, and that we're having a difficult time really allowing students to see themselves in that curriculum.
That sounds quite depressing.
No, because somebody is listening to what I'm saying, these fantastic ideas, and they'll change it.
Okay, sorry.
I'm not an educator, but I immerse myself. I actually go to people like her and say, tell me what makes a bad day. And have you ever read any of the curriculum documents? She's right. I mean, they're like 90 pages long and dense, and at the end, you sort of have to sign your name and say, I have taught all of this to my kids, right? End of story.
When you probably really haven't, right? Not totally, not exactly, not...
I believe there's only one politically correct answer.
I don't want to get into the weeds and only point the finger wagging at the curriculum. That's just one area where we can be more innovative. And a part of it, is teachers and parents and the stakeholders in education allowing ourselves to let go of the collective memory that we have of education, because that's getting in the way of innovation. So we all need to give ourselves some permission, some breathing space for some creative destruction, for some things to go, so that we can emphasize some things in the curriculum more than other things in the curriculum. And so I don't want to get too much in the weeds. I gave a very specific example, 4,500 years of history, but globally speaking, as all the stakeholders in education, we have to go, okay, what are the things that we're after? We're after actually some really important things that are going to have major benefits for students now and in the future, that don't just relate to the 3 R's, that relate to, Annie says, mental health, to their self-efficacy. Let's focus and because you're right, not that much time, so how do we prioritize? How do we let some things go that are less important?
Well, not that much time, and beyond that, Annie, not that much equity from time to time as well. You must have classes, never mind you have, of course, schools in great neighborhoods that may have access to a ton of technology, and schools in other neighborhoods that aren't so great that may not, because their parents can't afford to buy and donate a bunch of iPads to the school. But even perhaps within the same school, you get this kind of disequity as well. What are the ramifications of that?
In terms of, I think that is correct in terms of the sort of the technology piece. They're all the way around. So there is in terms of teachers' knowledge, as you said, or level of comfort. There is, if you're relying on parents to do the fundraising to buy all the smart boards and all the whatever. There is from the a principal's focus. There are a lot of things that can make a kind of either inequity or just a lack of consistency in a way. So one of the things when we put out a report on digital learning, we said there need to be guidelines. It's very hard in this way because you want to balance, right? What we don't want to do is add more things to the curriculum. We don't, and we also, part of what's exciting about the digital world is that it's open. It's full of sharing. It's it has a lot of messiness in it. So you don't want to stifle the creativity in that world, but it is really important right now. God bless all the companies, but there are a million companies out there seeing a bonanza of markets in schools where they can make a lot of money, and I'm sure lots of them have schools and education's best interest at heart, but there needs to be some way of evaluating that. We need to be able to, so there has to be some process for evaluating products that boards can go to, and I think that is the province's responsibility to set up something like that. And it's the same in terms of teachers' own innovation. One of the things we asked was whether or not, when teachers didn't have a textbook, what would they be most likely to turn to? And quite an extraordinarily high percentage of schools said free online material, which might be great, but it also might be not great. So how do we think about that? How do we ensure that our kids are getting Canadian stuff, for instance, and that it's of a good quality and that it's somehow connected to the curriculum? And some teachers are fabulously talented at searching that out, and others grew up in schools are not necessarily digital learners in that way. So how do we ensure there's professional development about that? But I think what you're saying is so important because we also have to stop thinking about education as a kind of delivery mechanism of information. So knowledge is out there everywhere. So we have to be teaching kids. I know this sounds so cliche, but anyway, we have to be teaching them how to learn. And we have to be teaching them the skills that they need to persist, to work with other kids. We have to teach them those skills, a lot of which can be taught with technology, but what we have to get away from, and what the space issue is, that if we've decided they need to know 9,322,000 facts by the time they graduate, we're done, and that's the thing that's changed. Facts are easy to find, but how you find them, how you assess them, how you use them, how you change them into something else, how you work with other people to create more stuff, that's the stuff we need to teach.
Joe, do you worry that the work that the people in this building are doing will eventually only end up in the hands of the students who go to the schools in the higher income neighborhoods, and the schools in the lower income neighborhoods that can't afford some of the technological innovation we're talking about are going to get further left behind? There's a gap already, and when technology is introduced, I guess the gap gets even bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge question on digital divide here. First of all, a lot of the entrepreneurs that we work with don't charge schools for their products. They know that that's not where the money lies. So they often look for other ways for charging for their services. A lot of them are not-for-profits. And I certainly think that's a role that the government can play, is to even the playing field on digital access, and having top-up funds for regions and districts that can't afford these tools. In one of People for Education's reports, there was the suggestion of an equity grant, right, that would even the playing field for schools and districts. And I think that's so important, because the difference is huge between what the poorest schools can fundraise from parent-teacher councils and what the best schools can.
Scott.
However, there is another part of this that is unbelievably important when we're talking about equity. And again, this is a little bit of a, I can rant a little bit as well. So
I wasn't ranting.
one of the problems is that you guys are awesome. Okay, you guys are awesome.
You mean these two teachers?
These two teachers.
I'm waiting for the
And
jab.
Steve.
The jab is coming.
No.
They are.
No, there is no jab. Okay.
No, what's the but, though?
The
There's a
but
but.
is, you guys are like 10%, right? They are the keener teachers. And one of the things that we see is that if we want this to work for every kid across the district, then we have to roll these solutions out across the district.
But you know
That's
what?
really critical.
In there's this sort of like, oh, teachers are cute puppies, we need to handle them carefully. And I really push back against that. And I think when you have this idea that innovation travels through a pipeline down to our lowly levels, then you're kind of setting up that exact situation. You're reinforcing that 10% that you see, that I see very differently. So how do we create platforms where we can honor teaching as a profession and build and allow that innovation to leak and to mix and to grow from the bottom? Because when you talk about a platform, well, those teachers, those poor darlings, what will we do with them? You're reinforcing that same situation. And also on the equity thing, there's a real risk there when we talk about equity. When teachers, we know this, right? This is something we say to each other that teachers know. Equity and fairness isn't that everybody gets the same, it's that everybody gets what they need. And so oftentimes, from my perspective, I see people wanting to deploy and to manage large scale, sustainable scale, these like big words where like, everyone in the board is gonna have iPads. Well, you know what often happens? The kickback from that is that actually nobody gets iPads. And all that glitters is not gold, and we definitely need to balance innovation and technology, but we should check to see which of those glittery things are gold. And do we need to have these like totally easy to deploy solutions for all 50 boards in Ontario that are totally disconnected from the unique needs of those particular communities where students and parents and teachers haven't been consulted? So I think if you start to ask kids what they want and ask teachers what they want and respond to the unique cultures that we have all across Ontario, I think that you would have a platform for innovation to grow.
But I'm going to go to bat for Scott a little bit here, only insofar as I think he meant you two are superb at what you do, but not every teacher is superb at what he or she does.
But every teacher wants to be superb, and more importantly, every teacher
wants
the
to be
best.
superb?
Every
Absolutely.
teacher wants the best.
Absolutely.
Every teacher wants the best for their children
kids.
in that classroom.
Yeah.
And we need to start from there.
Teacher, all 120,000 teachers in Ontario want to be superb. Just like every journalist wants to be superb, right?
Let's start from some.
You know, I'm actually totally agreeing with her on this. Every teacher, when we spent a year doing nothing but talking to teachers before we started building our stuff. We had this long questionnaire. We'd ask them things like, what makes a bad day and what makes a good day. We came out of that universally, every teacher we talked to, they want the very best.
How many did you talk to?
Maybe 75, right?
Out of 120,000.
Universally. In many different schools,
I
universally.
admit-
I'm playing the bad guy here just because.
Universally,
you know.
but it was so universal. It's clear. They want the very best for their kids. Here's the challenge, though. If we want this to be the very best for every kid in something like TDSP, we're talking about 235,000 kids, okay, spread across a wide variety of schools. Not all those schools are going to have teachers with the same ability, not abilities, but I mean time. It's like you said, making space. You know, rolling things out across the board is the one way where we can make it so when we look at, when I look at a board that we rolled out in Tampa, Florida, not a particularly rich district, 200,000 kids, and I can look at it and I can say, this is incredible. 50% of the kids in the lowest income zip code there check their homework once a day to see what they have. That's incredible. It's only 70% in the richest zip code. So if we can roll this out across the district, then we can make sure that every kid is getting it.
Okay, I didn't ask Michelle, I did ask John, I didn't ask Michelle. You have technology in your classroom?
I do.
How did it get there?
How did it get there? I teach a one-to-one iPad program. Each student in my class has an iPad. And I've been very fortunate because we've talked a little bit about partnerships and how important that is. And I am an action researcher, and I engage with research.
You're a what?
I'm an action researcher.
What does that mean?
It's a title I've made up myself that, that works very nicely when I write grants. But seriously, shouldn't there be action researchers? And this is what I do. I'm a bridge between the classroom and higher education and industry. So I seek out grants and partnerships where I can measure, where people with different perspectives and backgrounds can come and bump together, because that's where new ideas come from. And we test and measure innovation in the classroom. So my collaborator, Dr. Kostopoulos, and I from Wilfrid Laurier, we partnered to look at electronic portfolios in the classroom, and the best device for students to create experiences and performances of their learning, in my opinion, for this project was the iPad, and that's what we move forward with.
How many students in your class?
I have 21 kids.
And they all have an iPad?
They do.
Did they have to buy them?
No, that was part of the funding. So the part of the funding was for purchasing the devices, and then also to inquire and do research around that. So one of our research questions this year was looking at students' visual spatial understanding with iPad. So do you think maybe kids will have a better sense of two-dimensional geometry and mapping skills when they get to use, I don't know,
Minecraft?
Google Maps and Minecraft?
Yeah.
And so, but we're actually looking at what the improvements, quantitative data, looking at the improvements that students have in their visual spatial reasoning.
Okay, Annie, that's great for one classroom in London, Ontario. How do we do that in every classroom in Ontario?
I think you're making it sound like we're like, everything's terrible everywhere. When we just surveyed 1,349 schools, and 80% of them said kids start using computers in kindergarten, so that's when it starts, 80% of schools.
What kind of computers?
Mostly brand new. We did our press conference in a grade 4 class. They had a media cart. Everybody did have a laptop. There was a completely, totally wired classroom. Okay. And for the most part, even in terms of the digital divide, the old-fashioned idea of the digital divide is less and less true because, if you ask StatsCan, people have the internet at home. People have 58% of schools. They have some kind of bring your own device thing going on in the school. 99% of schools have the internet, of course. So that schools are wired and schools are doing amazing thing. What we found is actually that the policy hasn't caught up to the practice. It's happening already, and it's happening everywhere, and it's happening in all different ways. But what we don't have then is something not squelchy, but a little bit of overall kind of guideline so that we don't end up with inequity, but we also don't end up with not very good stuff in our classrooms. But I think it's too easy to go doom and gloom. Everything's terrible. There's no innovation. And
That's what we do in journalism.
Oh no! Well, I know, but it's not interesting because it's more interesting to actually get at the complexity of what the issues are rather than there's a bad guy and a good guy. And and you can argue with provincial education policy, but I actually think they are trying. There are networks for teachers to share. We just think there needs to be some kind of evaluation process so that so that you can go and, it's like research, right? You look for good research, peer-reviewed
Action
research.
research.
Yeah, no. And the action research, like the TLLP, whatever that stands for, maybe you were part of that, Teacher Leadership Learning program. There are teachers doing extraordinary things all across the province in their classrooms and sharing them with each other. And so I think what's important is to go, we got this going on. What can we do to make it better? How do we make sure that we're recognizing, that we're far past the land of kind of the technology's a machine, even though, yes, there are still teachers. If I were teaching, I'd be really bad at it. I had to give somebody my phone to say, I don't know how to turn this off. It's new. Can you turn it off for me? So I'm not a good example. But we're past that era. Computer labs. You don't go somewhere else to use the technology. It's there, and kids are the ones who are. I mean, the grade 4s we were doing this press conference with were doing incredible things. The grade 4s, like mind-boggling stuff.
We have a whole group of people here who came tonight, and I'm just looking for some indication if there's a microphone that we want to use for the people in the audience here when they ask questions or make comments to make sure that we can capture them for our broadcast. So here comes David Irwin with the microphone, just like that. Isn't that wonderful? I know this is a Canadian audience and no one wants to go first, but who's going to be brave and ask the first? Beautiful. Love it. Sir, if you would, up to the microphone. Make your comment, ask your question, direct it to whomever you like. Say your name and where you're from if you want to.
Sure. My name's Andrew. I'm from Toronto. I'm a software entrepreneur myself and considering doing my next venture in the education space. The question, actually, you know what? It's more of a suggestion. I'm not going to beat around the bush with this. I'm taking what you said about space, and I'm taking what you said about teachers all being intrinsically motivated to do good by their kids. And I can't help but think that a really interesting model, maybe one area where the government could help, is at a policy level thinking about things like 20% time, which creates that space in the classroom, and then put a dollar amount in each teacher's pocket to use towards a little bit of software, and let that dollar amount grow depending on the results from that 20% time.
What does that mean, Andrew, 20% time?
It means shrink the curriculum by 20% and use that 20% differently in every single classroom with every single teacher. Let teachers share their results amongst each other in terms of what they're doing with that time. Give them a little bit of a budget to go spend on software applications that are out there in market. You don't need to vet everything through the government just to roll it out in one classroom. I mean, John Gall's systemantics is basically like complex systems are just simple systems evolved, right? So just go at a really simple level and see who comes up with what.
Let me play the bad guy again for a second here, okay? John. Okay, 20% less. Sounds like a neat idea.
Cool.
You want to teach less history? You want to teach less math? You want to teach less English? You want to teach less social studies? Whose subject is going to be taught 20% less so we can create this open space Michelle talked about? Especially when parents want schools to start teaching their kids more.
That's a pretty heavy question.
Well, there you go. But that's where it gets to at the end of the day. Whose ox you going to gore?
You know what? I mean, when I look at it, it's got to. You want to make space for those skills-based curriculums, and so I mean, it's. I know what certain answers could be. I think that it's difficult to chop out parts of the curriculum and make space. Talking about 20%. I think that we need to get away from some of the very heavy content-laden pieces and
like
move more towards the skills. You know what? It's a hard call. I mean, how do you determine if something in history isn't worth studying? I mean, how do you determine if something in geography isn't worth studying?
Exactly.
I think at the end of the day, I think that if we continue to go back to those skills focus and less, I mean, I think that literacy has to be paramount through everything, and so that has to be our focus area.
Numeracy?
Numeracy for sure. Literacy and numeracy, I think, together are connected because those are our skills. But I think that when it comes down to history and geography, if somebody has the skills to be able to read, write, acquire the information, then I think that if you could drop them in any subject area and they could pull that information.
Michelle, your teaching day ends at what time?
3:30.
3:30. So why don't we keep the kids for another 2.5 hours? There's your 20% right there.
Okay. So in your mind of the classroom and our collective image of the classroom, if I wish that every moment of my day was like super effective and efficient, but the reality is there's some leakage in the classroom. There's some time that we're not using really effectively. And as we're trying to use more innovative teaching practices, like you said, moving away from the stage on stage, sitting down, small group instruction, there's a big question about like, what are the other children doing? And let's not have the other children be engaging in like knowledge and recall and practicing. Let's have them engaging in inquiry that's scaffolded, where we're checking in. So I think that it's not about making the school day longer or having to ditch, history or whatever. It's about how can we be innovative about what the school day looks like and our pedagogical practices. I can only teach so much standing in front of a group saying like, oh, and in this lesson we do this. Let's try to think about how the pedagogy and the shape can be different. Let's maybe go with what students are interested in. Maybe not all students are 100% interested in every aspect of the curriculum. So I just think that we need to learn to let some stuff go.
And also you can put things together, right? I mean, one of the things that I think we know, always my favorite thing, all the things we know, but is that you can learn a whole bunch of things at the same time.
Yeah.
So that idea that it's like, now we're doing geography, now we're doing art, now we're doing this, well, you can actually combine the learning too in a way so that it's not as, and I think it is an interesting, there's companies that it's like you have 10% of your own time to do whatever you want with. That which is called innovation, I think. But I think it's that there are different ways of doing things that aren't quite so cut and dried, but get us away from that idea of you've got 16 outcomes you've got to get to, and you've got to get them to them today.
Joe?
I think the language you use is very telling. The idea of more or less content.
The language I used?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
because it still goes back to this idea that education is stuff that we put in a kid's head and then it just sits there, the content. But kind of paradoxically, the thinner the curriculum in terms of content, the deeper the learning is. I'm loath to bring up Finland because these conversations always end at Finland, but the Finnish curriculum is very thin in terms of content, and its strength is its open-ended and broad, deep learning questions.
And they're number one in the world in everything in education, right?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah,
And
they are.
so the idea instead is not more or less content, but deeper or shallower learning. And the paradox is that with less content, you can often get deeper learning. I mean, and if you want to put a value on that, I mean, it's clear the metrics, a place like Google with the 20% time, every Friday, the employees work on whatever they want. The best return on investment in terms of things like Gmail and Google Maps have come out of that 20% time. That's when people's intrinsic motivation comes out and they really dig their teeth into what they want to study, and that's missing in education.
And the innovation, part of the innovation in that has to do with, there's somebody who's obsessed with this, Sheldon Levy, I think, has to do with failing, risk, trying things, realizing it doesn't work, trying something else instead, and that goes to that kind of deep learning too. So it's not just you learned these facts, now you're good to go. It's actually, what can I do with this? What can I do when I see a problem? How can I, in an innovative way, come up with solutions? And those solutions aren't necessarily technological, but they're me really using my brain.
Scott?
Well, and the other really neat thing is that those solutions can also use technology to effectively gain more space. So for example, if I came to you and said, what's the best way that I can improve the way that you can get through your email in a day? You only have 8 hours a day. Well, actually, the solution to that is that now, lucky you, you've got your email 24 hours a day right here. So suddenly we actually have more time to do that thing. So, you were talking about innovation in education. One of the really exciting things we can do is we can make space so that kids do learn in innovative ways from each other. So it's not just the sage on the stage, right? They learn a lot from each other, and that doesn't have to be face-to-face in the classroom. We can get that additional learning time when they're at home. So every time a grade 7 kid asks another grade 7 kid, how do you calculate the area of a circle? Those 2 kids have just learned something, and they were not in the classroom. Right?
John, you wanted to add?
Yeah, you know what, I think part of it is, when you asked me the question before, it's when you're looking at where you're going to draw that 20% from, a lot of times, because I teach intermediate, so we still have rotary. And so then that means that you're chopping time away from somebody else. And so I think part of it is the system has to change in respect to, even when you look at high school, we've got these, separations in disciplines. And so how can we start, and I think you're alluding to that, is how can we start to create more cross-curricular nature of the way we approach education, and to have those partnerships happening and not have, in many respects, siloed, disciplines. So, sorry, you're laughing.
No, I'm only laughing because I am so old that I went to school in the 60s. And in the 60s, I had a class that was called integrated. And it was just integrated everything. And it was 3 hours a day, and it was everything. It was in grade 11.
What school?
Point Grey in Vancouver. Integrated. And that's what it was called. And the thing is, it was an innovation, and it's the same innovation that we're looking for now. Yeah. And we did really learn things because everything was cross-disciplinary. We really had to think we played the drums a lot and maybe, did other things. But it was called integrated for a reason, because they understood that that integration was where the really wonderful learning happened. And I wasn't laughing at you, I promise.
No worries.
Who's going to go? Yes, please. Then you can go third, sir. Let's go here.
Hi, my name is Parthi. I'm a third grade teacher in the East End of Toronto. I have a question, but a quick comment on everyone's got their take on the Finnish example. And to speak to your point about teacher quality, I think Finland's approach to teacher selection is very intense. It's equivalent to a medical school acceptance, where there's a rigorous interview, and it's treated like, I believe it's a 3 or 4 year teacher training process. My question is it's an interesting education innovation example that's happened in Chicago, where it's a school called Sarah E. Good, and most of you, if you've seen the Time cover piece about a month ago, is a school that Obama actually visited this year, and it's a 6-year school that incorporates a very intensive math science component to a school in an area that's very underfunded, incredible social problems, homicide of 500 per year. And what they've seen is that this program, which teams up with IBM, guarantees a job for these graduates from the 6-year high school program, which they graduate with a high school diploma as well as an associate's degree. And the cause for, I guess, celebration is that in these communities where, as much as I believe in, these important ideas of, engagement, citizenship, and social emotional learning, that it doesn't pay the bills. So there's a desire for greater focus on these hard skills because they ensure employability and career success following graduation.
I think, having just gone to the province's Talent and Skills Symposium filled with business people, all business people and post-secondary people, saying social emotional skills are the thing. I mean, we have to focus on this if we want entrepreneurs, if we want people to be successful in their companies. And there were people there from IBM, and they were going, just teaching skills, which, and then everything changes, isn't enough. And that what they really need is people that can keep on learning, keep on innovating, so we just have to be careful about dividing, hard skills from soft skills, because they're actually there is a really important, and they are concrete array of skills and competencies that kids need to have. And they're probably learning those in that school too.
I think it's really important. I think that's the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, has released a report, and they're overwhelmingly there's an overwhelming consensus that the things that CEOs need to build their businesses are what we would call the 21st century soft skills, and I hate that term because they are the skills. Yeah.
Please do.
Those are the skills that will allow people to learn new hard skills.
Yeah.
If you just train everybody to work in a particular industry with a particular skill set of hard skills, that can be very inflexible for a rapidly changing economy. So what we need to do is we need to train young people to teach themselves and to relearn. And those skills of cooperation and collaboration and creativity and inquiry and determination are the things that will allow them to take charge of their lives and learn new hard skills if they need to.
Gotcha. Sir, you wanted to ask the next question, I think.
Hi, my name's Tim. I'm a high school teacher, recently retired. I taught history for about 35 years.
Which board, Tim?
Toronto board.
Okay.
Okay. Now, you've been talking about getting teachers to innovate. One of the times when teachers learn new things, be it technical or non-technical, is on professional development days. And about 3-4 weeks ago, the Friday before March break was a professional development day in the Toronto board, and I think most of the boards across Ontario. Yet on that particular day, the teachers were not professionally developing themselves. They were at home or elsewhere, and they were unpaid. And that was part of the contract.
Bill 115?
Bill 115, yeah. So I'm raising the hoary subject of politics here. I don't think you can separate what you're talking about in terms of innovation and improving the education system without talking about the politics. So to me, there's a bit of a disconnect if the government and the public are expecting teachers to innovate, yet the message they're sending is that the first priority is to deal with the education budget, because Bill 115 was all about shaving $1.5 billion off the education budget, largely on the backs of teachers' contracts. Mm-hmm. So how do you square that circle? How do you reconcile the message of you want teachers to innovate, but at the same time you're saying you're not really worth it?
Let me ask the two teachers here very directly. Michelle, have you forgiven the Ontario Liberal government yet for Bill 115?
Absolutely. I'm clearly an optimist. I take what's presented to me and I make it work. And we need to be scrappy and we need to get it done and we need to play nicely. So that's the situation. And since 2008, education is not the only sector that's had a bit of a tough time. So we all have to take a piece of that pie and swallow it, and it's a jagged pill, it's not nice, and move on. So let's move on. And professional development doesn't happen on a day. You're not like, oh, and today is Friday, and today we'll sit around and we will develop ourselves professionally. That'll be great. No, it's something that we have to be diligent about. It happens ongoing, and it happens when, in my opinion, when teachers have an opportunity to talk to other teachers and people in other industries, because you know where good ideas and new ideas come from, when kind of we bump into things. So you make time and you use social media to help you connect with other teachers. And Annie mentioned the Teacher Learning and Leadership Program. I've also been involved in other grants that pair industry, higher education, a classroom teacher. So we're doing research, ground level, what works in the classroom. And those grants allow for purchasing of technology, allow for release time for that professional development, and then allow for me to share.
Okay, let me ask John the same thing. Have you forgiven the Liberals yet for Bill 115?
Well, we had this conversation before this started, and I think at the end of the day, I know that it's easy to be political through this whole thing, but I think at the end of the day, when you have a desire to meet those kids in your classroom, you have a desire to sort of push their learning forward, and I think that we can get hung up on the politics of it. But I, when I go to school every day and I'm working with those kids, they're actually driving my innovation forward because of what they're doing. And
okay,
so
you two are Well, I should ask, are you two unusually forgiving? When you have these conversations with your colleagues, do they feel the same way as you do?
In my school, and I might have a unique school, but for the most part, people value their job, and they've moved on. To be honest,
I got to tell you, every time I tweet something about education, I get 30 tweets from angry teachers, 50 tweets from angry teachers who say, rah, 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 115.
But part of that is that we put mittens on children, and I think we'd all like the public to be like, we actually realize your work is hard, and I think we'd feel a lot better actually after that.
I think that's a good point too, and I think that if we're going to blame anybody, we have to actually, this is going to sound stupid too, but anyway, we have to blame ourselves because we have decided collectively that taxes are evil, that we don't want to pay for our public goods, of which a huge one is education. And so we've decided we want to do everything as cheaply as possible. And if we can't understand that investing in children, if it were the stock market, everybody'd be doing it because it's the biggest, bang for your buck you can get is that investment. Doesn't work very well because it doesn't come in 4 years. Fiona Nelson had the greatest line going, the problem is children take an unconscionably long time to grow up. But because, so then you don't get that instant return that you want politically. But we as a society are really doing ourselves a disservice because we don't want to spend money on things anymore. So we cut in order to, and we've decided taxes are evil.
If your premier is to be believed, there will be tax increases in this next budget to pay for things you like. We shall see. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jason Cunin. I'm a teacher with Toronto District School Board. I guess before I begin my comment, I want to point out for discussion on innovation, we have a striking lack of diversity among the panel. I'll just point that out. And when we talk about innovation...
Jason, what would you have liked to seen tonight?
Perhaps at least some racial diversity that reflects the diversity of the students in our schools. That would be a good place to start, I think. And I think if we're going to be talking about innovation, equity is a very good place to be beginning to talk. Innovate. Now, I think when we talk about innovation, we have to be asking the question about what are we innovating toward. And so far, I've been here for about an hour, and I feel that a lot of the discussion has been taking place within a certain parameter, a certain taken for granted assumption that what we're talking about innovating towards is accommodating students toward a particular market model. So I've heard one member of the panel talk about kids and service delivery as if we're talking about books on Amazon. Innovation in the schools is framed in terms of how many jobs it's creating in the tech sector. And maybe we need to be talking about, rather than talking about how we serve students but how we educate students to contribute to the market system, we need to be talking about in terms of innovative pedagogy, how we talk about teaching them to organize to make the market system serve them, which is what we're not talking about. If you want to talk about innovation in schools, I think we need to move outside of the neoliberal model that education has been working under for the last 20 years. You know what innovative in my school would be? Enough caretakers to keep the bathrooms open all day long. It would be enough infrastructure repairs to keep the roof from leaking. That's what we're talking about when talking about innovation. And if we want to talk about how we're going to prepare kids for the life when they graduate, maybe we need to start talking about free university tuition, because most of my students are terrified and extremely stressed by the amount of debt that they're going to have to incur, by the lack of jobs
Can I ask you a very direct question?
So,
would you be prepared to see your taxes go up in order to pay for those things? Because those things do cost more money.
Yes, I
would
would.
be.
Yes, I would. And we have to also be talking about broader social policies with regards to what we're going to fund as a society. And that's not just individual taxes. That's not just personal taxes. We're talking about corporate taxes. It means really looking at the economic system that our kids are growing up in, that is seeing a world of diminishing opportunities for them. And we need to be able to teach them, if we're going to talk about innovating, we need to be able to teach them to think outside of that market box, this service delivery box, as if our kids and their parents are customers and we're service providers.
Okay, I give you credit for this. Most people, when you say they want the government to spend more money on things, they say, but don't raise my taxes. At least you have had the consistency to say,
and we need to
raise
start
my
organizing to change that conversation.
Yes,
and it's our students. Don't look to my generation to do it. I mean, my generation
You'll
is
keep
a write-off.
watching the agenda. We'll have a program on this very topic in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. They'll be
Keep
here.
We're going to
watching.
start a
Thank
group
you.
called People for Taxes.
Jason will be your first member. Yes, please.
Hi there. My name is Zain Gadiali. I'm a teacher.
What's your name, sorry?
Zain
Zain.
Gadiali. Hi. I also want to extend some of what Jason said, and this is tied to essentially, I think we have a real risk of fetishizing concepts such as technology when we examine instruments. If you look at the word technology, the logos of a techne, it's an approach to fellow human beings, how we relate to each other, to nature, and so forth. That's really what technology is about. So humans are technological by their very nature. So when we say, well, you're going to use something and implement it as if that's a panacea, I think that's a problem there. I think the real issue is when we talk about motivation. When we talk about these aspects, we've got to look at the structure, the fundamental practices. What about teacher autonomy? You talked about Finland. There's enormous amounts of autonomy. I think a number of times students may be risk averse is because of grades themselves. So we have a market model in place which we just use as a mantra. Oh, here it is, it works here, and so on and so forth, but we don't look at the specifics of it. How does it work with motivation? Many studies have shown that actually it hinders motivation of a certain type, such as critical thinking or learning and so on, if you just have grades assigned to it. Because you know this is what you've got to get, and you answer to that.
Yeah.
So that's now tied to structure. That's not really in the hands of teachers oftentimes. These decisions are made somewhere else. So we don't have much say in that decision-making itself, which is very central.
What could you
to
do
this
about
discussion.
that?
What's that?
What could be done about that?
Well, first of all, you can have all sorts of various teacher groups. You can have, I aspire, of course, towards workers' democracy. Now, of course, it's a very political concept, but again, it's a legitimate issue because I think for me, schools is not just about, I say, well, it's about students. It's actually a place, it's a relation between individuals.
But that's what the union leaders, I think, see their job as being, to represent teachers to the provincial government on more than just contract issues, on education issues as well.
That's true, but on a daily basis, it's essentially the rank and file who do the things, right? So that has to be part of that whole process in terms of how we design, how we have these discussions. Oftentimes, we often feel that it's a top-down process, that we may want to go in these directions, but we can't. And I think oftentimes, you have innovation through various discussions. Simply by saying, oh, well, competition will lead to so and so, I think it's fairly simplistic. Right, and we've seen that. So I think we need to have...
okay, Zain. Thanks for the comment. Sure. I want to save time for some informal conversation as well. So let's do one more question. Gentleman right here to the microphone. And then...
Thank you. My name is Hamoon. I run an initiative right here at Mars Discovery District called Studio Y, which is actually focused on bringing young people from across Ontario together around and experimenting with these things around future of learning and education. A quick comment and then an opportunity for change that I'd love the panel's help with.
Sure.
The comment is, I'm not sure why we're having a panel rather than running your campaign to become Minister of Education. So that's the comment. And for the opportunity, this morning I was in Montreal, presenting to an expert panel on skills for the future of Canada, relevant to this conversation. Covered almost all of the themes you've been speaking about. Pointed to reports from the Council of Chief Executives, from Conference Board, all over. Loved it. The response was, we can't include this in our report. We're only going to focus on STEM skills because there is not academically validated research to support all of this meta skills, all of the stuff we've been talking about. I have a submission due to them as a follow-up in a couple of weeks. I'd love some references towards where academically validated rear view mirror type research talks about this stuff.
Good stuff. Thank you, Hamoon. Meredith, why don't you come on up and wrap this thing up here because you so skillfully produced it.
Because you love making speeches.
What did you guys think? So I've been asked to remind everybody that TVO is not fully funded by the government, and so you all have a pamphlet on your chair. So if you feel like becoming a member, that would be great. And we want to thank Mars for the lovely venue. And our panelists. And that's it. Any suggestions or comments or ideas of other meetups you'd like to see or how you felt about this one, you can leave a comment at the back. So, enjoy.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. Minister.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.